A few weeks ago, we were looking in Ecclesiastes, and we saw how Solomon pointed out that we will ultimately be forgotten. Legacy, in and of itself, is inconsequential because we are going to be forgotten. Memorials and money, inheritance that we might even leave to people, those things don't actually really matter in the light of all of eternity. But hopefully we didn't come to the conclusion that then it doesn't really necessarily matter how we live or even how we die, because to God it absolutely matters how we live and how we die in the faith. The motivation is not legacy. It's not about how we're going to necessarily be remembered. The motivation, on the other hand, is the fear of God, that we live in awe of God, both as Father and as Judge, and die with confidence that we will ultimately enter into the joy of our Master. So it does absolutely matter how we live and how we die. But that then needs to lead us to ask the question, how then do we actually live in fear of God? And the answer that I get from Solomon, while uncomfortable, it's not really that complicated. We live with death in mind. That's how we live in the fear of God. At this point in our sermon series, we're actually going to be leaving. We kind of already have started a little bit from the last couple of weeks, but we're actually leaving the philosophers, but we're not necessarily leaving the philosophies behind. Because basically what we know to be true in our day and age, and just about in any other day and age, is that there aren't really pure followers of certain philosophies. There aren't pure Marxists. There aren't pure laissez-faire-ists, laissez-faire capitalism-ists. Capitalists? There we go. That's the word I'm looking for, right? There's nobody that's really pure in one particular philosophy, but we basically have done is we take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. We've made a buffet of philosophy. We've brought them all together because we like the way that they sound. We like the way that they're going to make us feel, or the prosperity that they might bring us, and so we put them all on our plate, and we swallow those philosophies, and so all of a sudden we are nourished by philosophies that have about as much nourishment as a candy bar. Because they sound so good, we follow them, but also because we have actually opened up ourselves. We've opened up our hearts, we've opened up our minds to the pagan ways of the world, the secular ways of the world, and we've accepted them without giving much thought to them. So as I studied for this sermon, one particular thought continuously came to mind, and that thought was Jonathan Edwards. I'm not like the biggest Jonathan Edwards fan. I think he's great. I think he did a lot for theology and a lot for America and a lot for evangelicalism and revival, but I don't know a whole lot from him. I haven't read all of his works, but I have read his resolutions many times, and these are not like New Year's resolutions that we make and break pretty quickly. I think what's the day? January 19th or something like that is the end of resolutions. That's typically when most people have already broken their resolutions for the year. That's not Jonathan Edwards. He wasn't making New Year's resolutions. He was making life resolutions. He made about 70 of them. And he made them actually when he was late teens, early 20s. This is how he wanted to live. And there's one of them. Many of them actually have to deal with death that show that he lived with death in mind. But there is one in particular that I want to share with you this morning. If you've never read through these resolutions, I would encourage you to do so. Just Google Jonathan Edwards resolutions, you'll find them. But this is the one that I read from him. It says, "Resolved that I will live so as I shall wish I had done when I come to die." Resolved that I shall live so as I shall wish I had done when I come to die. That is the heart of Ecclesiastes 7, that we live with death in mind. Or another way to put it maybe if you really want more of a modern way of putting it, is let's live so that when we come to die, we're not haunted by how we lived. So as we open up the text this morning, I want us to notice 4 attributes of a life that has been lived with death in mind. If we are going to live with death in mind, these are really the way that these are the ways that we will live. The first attribute that we find in verses 1 through 6, we must live soberly. We have to live soberly. The second one, 7 through 13, we need to live wisely. The third one, verses 14 through 18, we live prudently. And the last one for the rest of the chapter, verses 19 through 29, we live resolutely. We live soberly, wisely, prudently, and resolutely. And if we will do that, ultimately, the only way that we can do all 4 is if we are living with death in mind. So let's take a look at that first attribute of living with death in mind. Because basically what I want us to do is understand when we live with death in mind, we have to absolutely 100% live soberly. In other words, we have to then live in reality. We cannot live with our heads in the clouds. It makes no sense to live with our heads in the clouds. Now, we're not going to look at all these verses in chapter 7, but we do want to take a look at some of these verses, and I'm just going to kind of go through them quickly without actually going and pointing out every single verse. But in verse 2, again, I think that summarizes exactly what Solomon is saying here. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. So when I first started out in ministry, Katie and I had gotten married, and her pastor, her home pastor, was Dave Sommerfeld, and he kind of took me under his wing, became my mentor for a while. But one of the first things that he ever said to me, one of the first pieces of advice, or one of the first explanations of his ministry, was that he would rather do a funeral than a wedding. Which blew my mind because I'm very uncomfortable at funerals. I mean, I'm uncomfortable at weddings too, but I'm really uncomfortable at funerals. Come to think about it, I'm pretty much uncomfortable everywhere. But the reason that he said this was basically that when you go to a wedding, when you are performing a wedding, everybody's just all happy, they're go lucky, right? Nobody actually wants to hear anything that the pastor has to say. All that matters is really what the bride has to say, and maybe what the bride's mother has to say. But nobody cares what the pastor has to say. But when you do a funeral, you have so many there that are left with questions and looking to the pastor for the answer. So he would rather do a funeral than a wedding because more people are attentive to their own lives and where they stand with God. The worldview of today is that you only live once. YOLO, carpe diem, gather ye rosebuds while you may. And those have this idea of death in mind. They kind of masquerade with death in mind. Like we know that we're going to die, and so we better start living. But that's a false way of thinking. That is the wrong way to think of it. That's not the right philosophy. Because basically all of those philosophies, though they have the appearance that life is lived with death in mind, really what they're saying is, no, that's life with death as an interruption. And so you better get all the fun that you can before death interrupts all that fun. That's not what Solomon is saying. Nothing could be further from the truth. Solomon is saying, no, you live with the idea that at any moment, at any second, you could die. And then you form your life around that idea. Living with death in mind is to live soberly. It's coming to the realization that all that we have, all that we've grown attached to, will one day no longer be ours. And that could be in the next moment. That's why Solomon says, let's take a look at verse 4. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. See, the fool doesn't give a whole lot of thought to death. The wise, on the other hand, they give it some serious thought. They stop and every once in a while, often, they will stop and think through what it would mean for them to have died. It's not that they never have fun. It's not that this person's never, it's not like they're killjoy or anything. It's nothing like that. It's not that they don't have fun. It's not that they don't laugh. But they realize that death has more to say to them than life ever will. The fool avoids thinking about death. They do anything that they can to distract themselves from thinking about death. It's basically kind of like C.S. Lewis. If you remember in the Screw Tape Letters, that first chapter, the guy is sitting there in the museum, and he's looking at he's reading and looking at some art, and he begins to think about himself, his own mortality. He begins to think about God. And then Satan knows that we can't do that. We can't allow them to think deeply about these things of mortality and of God. And so he begins to send distractions about lunch. Oh, these things are much too important to think about on an empty stomach. Let me go and have some lunch, and then I can think about them. And in the moment that he steps outside the museum, he sees all these other distractions, and he forgets it entirely. That is what a fool will do. They will not listen. They will not think about death. They do not go to the house of mourning because it's just too uncomfortable for them. And so they distract themselves in any possible way that they can, whether it's games, whether it's movies, whether it's books, whether it's television, whatever, sitting, going out with friends, whatever it has to be, so that they don't have to think about their own mortality. And Solomon says that's a foolish way of thinking. If you're looking to gain wisdom, if you're looking to gain righteousness, if you're looking to gain morality, the first place you should be looking is to a funeral. And the last place you should ever be looking is to something that just gives you surface laughs, superficial laughter. And yet, oftentimes, and I know this is true in my past, oftentimes we will take our life lessons from rom-coms and sitcoms. I grew up on The Cosby Show. I loved The Cosby Show. When I looked at Cliff Huxtable and I said, that's the kind of dad I want to be. I did kind of want to be like my dad, but I really wanted to be like Cliff Huxtable, who had those quirky sayings and quirks about him, and yet he was always a good father, always a loving father. It was just, it's like, that's who I want to be like. We learn life lessons. And Solomon says, that's foolish to go to the house of mirth and try to learn about life. You should go to the house of mourning instead. It's not that laughter doesn't have anything to say, but cheap laugh, superficial laughter, those flare up for a moment like thorns. That's what Solomon likens it to. Like thorns in a fire. It flares up quickly, and it dies down just as quickly. And it leaves us just as empty as when we began. Sober living opens us up to focus on what truly matters, a life lived of godly character and what God can accomplish, not what we can. See, when we live with death in mind, we live, again, as if any moment we'd die. And that means there are probably quite a few activities that we would forego if we knew that we would die at any moment. That's another one of the resolutions that Edwards gave, that he would never want to do anything if he knew that it was the last hour of his life. Never want to do anything wrong that he would be ashamed for people to find him doing in the last hour of his life. If we live with death in mind, we avoid those areas. That shameful sin that you've stopped fighting with and have started to make peace with would be avoided if you truly thought that any moment you could die. But if you also knew that you'd pass from this life into the next in the middle of serving others, loving your family and your friends well, walking in the path that God has called you to walk, you'd probably consider that to be a pretty good death. You would be happy for people to find you doing those exact actions. It's an old joke. Maybe you've heard it, maybe you haven't. Let's see who has, if anybody has. Why do old people read their Bibles so much? Anybody has heard this joke? Maybe it's just among us pastors. Do you know? No? No. The punchline is because they're getting ready for the final exam. Now, God has no final exam. He's not going to bring us into heaven whether based on how much knowledge that we have of Scripture. But the more that we read of it, the more that we read from the Bible, the Word of God, the more that it helps us to live with death in mind. But we don't want to just live soberly. There's a second attribute that Solomon says. We need to live wisely as well. We need to live wisely. Again, we're not going to read every single verse, but we're going to take a look at verse 13 quickly. He says, "Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked?" In other words, a wise person is going to consider God's work and live in it rather than trying to live in his own, rather than trying to fight against what God is leading him into. We're going to accept that this is the path that God has for us. The world is not really what God has created it to be in the least. However, the world is exactly as God intends it to be at this moment. I want you to let that sink in. It's not what God created it to be, but it is as God intended it to be at this very moment. Because God is sovereign, and this world plays by God's rules and by God's direction, not its own. God, in his providence and in his sovereignty, has complete control over every aspect of this world and our lives. And if we take this the wrong way, if we allow ourselves to misunderstand this truth, then what we'll end up is a fatalistic, it doesn't matter what I do kind of mindset. But that's not what this doctrine teaches. It's not what this is saying at all. What Solomon wants us to see is that a life that is lived with death in mind is a life that learns to live in harmony with God's ultimate plan and God's ultimate reality. And that flies in the face of today's philosophy that basically says that we're supposed to create our own paths in our lives. We chart our own courses. And so what often happens in our lives, especially even in our religious activities, is that we become like Paul before his conversion. You'll remember that Paul was a zealous Jew. And he was fighting against the church. He was persecuting them, throwing them in jail, killing them, having them killed, rejoicing when they were killed. Anyone who is following after Jesus who claimed to be the Messiah. And then, if you remember, Jesus stops him in his tracks on the road to Damascus. And he says to him, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And then he adds the phrase, it's hard for you to kick against the goads. Goads were these tiny spikes that were to keep the oxen moving in the direction that the driver wanted them to move. And so if the oxen then got upset and didn't like where they were going, they would kick as much as they could. Didn't hurt the driver any. Sure did hurt themselves. Nobody likes to be goaded. And yet we've all been goaded, and we have goaded other people. We have all been pressured by those who are around us, by maybe family, maybe friends, maybe enemies. They have pressured us to do certain acts and think certain thoughts. We have been goaded into them. We don't really necessarily like it. Sometimes we will fight back against it. But here's the thing. God will sometimes have to goad us because we would rather not take the carrot but feel the stick. Because we're stubborn that way. God goads us when we refuse to move in the right direction because we don't like it. It may even seem like it's the wrong direction to us. But it's the right way to go. That's what Solomon's raising here. He's raising that same kind of thought. Stop going in a direction that seems right in your eyes and start walking in the path that God has already prepared, even if it seems crooked to you. And by crooked, he doesn't mean wrong and bad. Curvy, not easy. If you've ever seen flight plans of airplanes, you'll notice that they have arcs on them. You ever seen that? They go in an arcing pattern. And we've been taught all of our lives that the fastest way from point A to point B is what? A straight line, but planes almost never go in a straight line. They always have this arc to them. It is counterintuitive to us, but that's because in flying, the most direct path is usually not a straight line. That's basically Solomon's wisdom there. Imagine that we're flying from St. Louis to Atlanta. And we're looking at the flight plan of that flight, and we see that we're actually going northeast before we ever start going southeast to Atlanta. We're just kind of doing this kind of thing. And we look at that and go, that's the dumbest way. I mean, the only worst way to get to Atlanta is to actually go through Japan or something. And right? Why are we going northeast to go southeast? It doesn't seem right to us. The beginning, as Solomon would say, isn't as good as the end. The beginning doesn't look right to us. But in the end, we discover that we made it. And not only that we made it, but we made it safely. And we made it right on time. What we need to do is trust God with the end. Even when we don't understand the beginning. Rather than thinking that we know best, we need to humble our spirits and rely on God's wisdom. And then as we're going on that flight plan, we begin to encounter some turbulence. We don't like turbulence. We'd like to fly above the turbulence maybe, or maybe just land and wait for the turbulence to be over, but we certainly don't want to go through the turbulence. It's extremely uncomfortable, and what if we get hurt? Or what if, worse, the plane goes down because of the turbulence? See, that's in verse 9. There's fear that often comes with turbulence, and out of that fear, we can often get angry. We want a different route. We want to fly above the turbulent air. We want anything but to actually go through it. And Solomon says, sometimes we got to go through it. And we get angry with God that he's making us go through this moment, and he's making us go through this moment in this way. And Solomon says that anger, that kind of anger, that is a fool's reaction. The wise actually see the turbulence and realize that that is God's flight plan, and it is good that we go through it. It's part of the journey. And that turbulence is, again, you've often heard, where faith grows. So there are times where we just wish that the plane would just turn around. Let's just go back to St. Louis. Sometimes we actually land in Atlanta, and we look at the traffic there, and we long for the traffic of St. Louis. You know they have 16 lanes in Atlanta, and it's bumper-to-bumper traffic, dead stop for about 3/4 of the day. Do you know that? I don't want to ever hear anybody complain about St. Louis traffic. Right? Just saying. We get to Atlanta and we're like, this is not the place for me. I don't want to be here. I thought maybe I did, but I don't want to be. I want to be back in St. Louis. Give me St. Louis any single day, right? That's how we are. And so in that way, we're a lot like the Israelites. The Israelites who looked back while they're wandering in the wilderness and going, oh, remember those leeks and those cucumbers and the fish that we were able to eat? Do you remember that? That was living back then. Why are we here? It makes no sense. See, that's what what Solomon is saying here. That's verse 10, where we want to go back to the good old days, whether they were the 50s or whether they were when we were teenagers. Man, if we could just have that America back, that would be fantastic. Everything was so good then. Solomon says that's the fool's heart. Why would we want to do that? All we are doing is focusing on all the good that happened in those times. We are not facing any of the bad that was happening in those times. We're totally misremembering what's happened. What Solomon says is that we need to look at today, and we need to see and focus on what God is doing now and join in. He has made the path for us, and we might see it as crooked, and he says, stop looking for the straight path. Go the path that God has made for you, right here and right now. Join in. Stop thinking about what used to be comfortable in the past, because as long as you're doing that, you're missing what God is doing in the present. Beloved, let me ask you this. Where are you kicking against the goads? What part of life are you fighting God? The direction that he's having you go. You're uncomfortable. It's not what things used to be. It's not how you wanted it to turn out. It's a very crooked path to you. How are you kicking against the goats? See, we as believers, we need to look at this life as an inheritance that God is giving to us. It's valuable, and yet so easily squandered. That's why in verse 11 and 12, Solomon says that that wisdom is good with an inheritance. And wisdom should be guarded like money. Because it teaches us how to spend and invest our lives well. A foolish person is going to burn through his inheritance. We see that with the prodigal son. Prodigal just simply means squandering. A foolish person squanders the inheritance that he has been given, and he ends up with nothing in the end. Those who do not live then with death in mind squander what they have been given in life, the very lives that they have been given as an inheritance. They squander it, and they end up with nothing to show for it in the end. But there's a third attribute of living with death in mind. So the first one is that we are supposed to live soberly. The second one is that we should live wisely. The third one is that we should live prudently. And by that I mean that we should really live cautiously. We live cautiously. It literally, or maybe another word that we could say is shrewdly. But it's living with death in mind literally. Because imprudence can actually cause death. If we decide that we're going to live without caution, if we're going to risk and be reckless, we could actually die as a result. There is a reason why women live much longer than men. For whatever reason, we have less caution built in us. And Solomon says, stop it! Live with some caution, live with some prudence. This is what we see in verses 16 and 17. Let's look at them real quick. Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself to be too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Be not overly wicked. Neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? And if we're not careful, we look at these verses and go, oh, everything in moderation. Yes, sirree, Bob. Let's not be too righteous. We can be a little righteous, but not too righteous. And we can be a little wicked, so long as we don't go too far with it. That is not what Solomon's saying. He is not proclaiming everything in moderation. What he is proclaiming, however, is that when we are in our righteousness, we can get a little too righteous there. And so we need to be prudent about how we live. Let's look back just to get the full understanding here. Let's look back a few verses. Because here we see that Solomon is instructing that it's okay. Let's go back to verse 14. We're not going to read it, but if you look at verse 14, you'll see that basically Solomon is saying it's okay to be joyful on good days. You should be joyful. In fact, he commands, be joyful on good days. But he also says on those bad days, you have to really consider what God is doing in them. Consider God's hand as he is working through them. This goes back to the idea of living wisely, that we ought to actually go into the house of mourning and consider our lives, because death has a lot to say. Bad times have a lot to say. Hurting and mourning have a lot to say about how we should then live our lives and what God is doing in them. So we need to slow down and we need to contemplate life. So when it's joyful times, sure, enjoy them, rejoice in them. When there's bad times, think through them. What are you learning here? Because it seems to Solomon that only the good die young, as the song is apt to say, and the wicked, even in their wickedness, die older. Why might that be? Because it's the righteous, again, we're too righteous, and the wicked, we're not too wicked. It's not always the case, but it is often the case. And it seems that Solomon has noticed that it often is. So again, let's try to understand the reasoning here. Many righteous people, again, not all of them, but many of them, this is what he's cautioning against. Many righteous people decide in their righteousness that they're going to enter into areas that they don't belong in. They're getting out of their lane. They want to offer their words of wisdom, and they want to offer their reflections on righteousness, and yet it is neither the time nor the place to do it. That's living in imprudence, not imprudence. And it sounds counterintuitive to say that offering wisdom and righteousness is imprudent, but it absolutely can be that way. One of my favorite proverbs comes out of Proverbs chapter 26, verse 17, because it's just fun. He says, whoever meddles in a quarrel not his own is like one who takes a passing dog by the ears. I love that one. It's bad enough to be embroiled in your own conflict, but stepping out of our lane to enter into a conflict that is not our own is reckless. We might as well grab a stray scavenger dog by the ears because we'll probably have a better outcome. We're being overly wise and we're being overly righteous. In other words, if you haven't picked up on it, we've gone past what God has called righteous, and we have set up our own standard of righteousness, much like the Pharisees. We've become self-righteous. We think we're helping, when in fact, we are acting recklessly. And we end up, as Solomon would put it, destroying our lives. Can we not see how this, the opposite, I guess, of this philosophy? We see how the world ends up doing this very thing, that they are overly righteous and overly wise. Our society does it. We do it all the time. We speak truth to power rather than keeping our mouths shut. We speak our mind without regarding the timing or the placement, protesting at funerals, barging into worship services, maybe just even forwarding on reels and TikToks, tweets, without actually checking the facts and whether they are true and what the outcome very well may be. Who is this going to affect? So brothers and sisters, let me ask you again, is there some part of your life that keeps you, tempting you to get involved in a situation that is none of your business?
Is there something that eats at your personal sense of righteousness but has nothing really to do at all with the righteousness that God has called us to? On the other hand, we can also be overly wicked. The wicked could be overly wicked. But Solomon isn't saying, a little bit of wickedness is okay. Just don't get too far into it, right? He's not saying be moderate in your evil doings. It's not what he's saying at all. What he is saying is basically that we all have a sin nature. We are all prone to wickedness already. We don't need any help. Stop looking for ways to be wicked. You'll be that way by nature. You'll do those things without having to try. It's like that old saying goes that every choice that we make is one step further in developing our character. It may be, or it may seem as if stealing this little piece of gum over here doesn't amount to a hill of beans. It's not that big of a deal. It's not too wicked. It's just a little wicked. And yet, that decision to steal that piece of gum makes it that much easier the next time because we are desensitizing our own minds and our own consciences against stealing. And so it makes it that much easier the next time to steal something, and then something else, and then something else, and the bigger and bigger and bigger it gets. Because we are beginning with that decision, with that evil decision that we are already prone to start stealing. Or it's not that big of a deal to cheat on the homework that you forgot about last night. Your friend is more than willing to let you see the answers. You can't afford to get a 0. And so, you give in to that temptation, which then leads to another temptation to cheat. And before you know it, you're cheating on a quiz here and there, and you cheat on a test, and maybe you cheat on a final exam. And you wake up one day realizing you're nothing more than a cheater. And the idea of faithfulness never even enters into your mind. Does it always go that way? No. We never know when it will. Solomon says, stop with the wickedness. We're already prone to do it. We must fight against it. So then, again, I ask, where are you at this moment walking? Where are you walking in sin at this moment in your life? What part have you been refusing to turn away from so that your character may come out purer on the other side? Isn't now the time to turn from that? See, Solomon says in 7:18, he says, "It is good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand. For the one who fears God shall come out from both of them." So again, what does it fear? What does it look like to fear God? It looks like prudence. Know how to stay in your own righteous lane and how to restrain your own tendency toward wickedness. How do you do that? By keeping in mind that any moment could be your last. So we've seen that living with death in mind means that we live soberly, we live wisely, we live prudently. Now lastly, what we see is that we live resolutely. We need to live resolutely. We need to know what kind of person that we want to be at our death so that we can be that person while we live. And we see this cryptically, but it's there. I'm going to show you why it's there. In the last verse, look at verse 29. "See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. So keep in mind that Solomon, in his own wisdom, or not in his own wisdom, but in the wisdom that God has given to him, he is now living life. He has lived life according to man's wisdom, not God's, but he has decided that he's going to live according to man's wisdom, do what man's wisdom would teach him and tell him to do, and see how that works out. In other words, he's living by man's wisdom so that we don't have to. He's done the wrong so that we don't have to. He's created or made those mistakes so that we don't have to. And in verses 19 through 25, he recounts how wisdom, even man's wisdom, is valuable. But so long as it is man's wisdom, so long as it is under the sun, apart from God's wisdom, apart from God, it is so limited. It is so limited. And he doesn't use those words. But what we do see is that he uses the same phrasing that he told us way back in chapter 1 as to what his mission was. What his mission in all of this ecclesiastical matters, all these Ecclesiastes matters, what his mission was. That he was going to live this life this way. And yet it was a mission that he says is striving after wind. It's a fool's errand. It's a mission that brings vexation. Why? Because it's a mission under the sun, apart from God. And he is vexed by all the scheming that mankind does. We scheme to go against what God has created us to be, which is being upright. People will do anything to keep from being upright. Remember that whole, we're all naturally prone to do wicked things? And now he's saying, yeah, that's our scheme in life. We come up with as many ways as we possibly can to do it. And he says in verse 20, he says, there's not anybody righteous, basically quoting his own dad. There's really nobody righteous. Nobody gets through this life without sinning. Nobody is righteous. And then he reminds the master, hey, you know what? Don't take to heart what people say, because you're going to one day hear a servant cursing you, and you're going to get angry with that servant, but you need to keep in mind that you too, you're not any better than your own servant. You too have cursed other people. Because there's nobody righteous, not even one. Nobody gets through this life without sinning. So maybe what you need to do is keep that in mind and be a little bit more gracious. It's not just servants and masters, though. It's also men and women. Some interpret this as husbands and wives, but I think men and women is fine. And Solomon, he sought out this upright living and concluded from his own personal experiments that maybe, this is Solomon saying it, not me, so don't get mad at me, that maybe 1 in 1,000 men are righteous, are virtuous, they are upright, but he hasn't been able to find one woman. That's what he says. And that's not an indictment against all women. It might seem like it, but it's really not. What this is an indictment against the very women that Solomon has surrounded himself with. I was joking with Drew about this the other day, thanking him that he gave me this passage so that I have to preach it instead of him. But he responded, and it was actually great. I don't know if he had already studied it or what, but he responded with something great. He's like, well, how many wives and concubines did he have anyway? 700 wives, 300 concubines. You do the math real quick. How many is that? It's 1,000. So he's like, 1 in 1,000 men, maybe. No women. Well, he's already surrounded himself with 1,000 wives and concubines. And what we know is 1 Kings 11:3 says this. He says he had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. Not one of them turned his heart towards the Lord. So how would we ever say that any of them could ever be upright? we want to, what Solomon says is that we have to live resolutely, that if we want to simply live in the moment rather than living with death in mind, ultimately we are going to seek out ways that we can avoid living uprightly. Because we're living with what we want here and now, not who we want to be when we enter into eternity. And so we will scheme our way to get whatever we want, whenever we want it, however we can get it, if we're not living with death in mind. Our philosophy in the West leans heavily towards, especially in America, leans heavily towards the self-made man or self-made woman. And we will rely on our own pride, our own intellect, our own strength, our own talents to accomplish whatever our hearts can scheme. That's not what God has created us to be. He created us to be upright. And the greatest way that we can do that is to resolve to live as we would want to be when we die. Now, one of us is going to get out of here without sin. But there's more than one way to be upright. See, on our own, it is impossible. And yet, when we put our faith in Christ, it is more than possible. We become united to Christ when we put our faith in him. And what we see in 2 Corinthians 5:21, one of my favorite verses, for our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that, this is the purpose, we might become the righteousness of God. It's what we call imputed righteousness. It's a righteousness that is not our own. God clothes us in his own righteousness. He clothed us in Jesus, and then he clothed Jesus in our sin. It's like he removed the garments from us, put on the robes of himself, and then gave our clothes over to Jesus himself. So all those schemes and all of those sins have been removed, and righteousness has been given. So as we live with death in mind, it's not really even our own death so much as it is the death of Christ as well. He died that we might live as God created us to live. And as we live in light of his death and his resurrection, the more we grow into that righteousness that God has clothed us in. See, we can resolve to live rightly all we want, but unless we actually are first declared righteous by God, unless we are clothed in the righteousness of God, which comes with the indwelling of the Holy Spirit within us, then we cannot actually live uprightly. And yet, united to Christ, we cannot just only resolve to live uprightly so that we are who we want to be when we die, but it is possible. Through faith in his death and resurrection, we actually can do it. So as we close Ecclesiastes 7, we have seen these four attributes of living with death in mind, that we live we live soberly, we live wisely, prudently, and resolutely. Yet none of those attributes will ever convince God to rule in our favor when Judgment Day comes. It's profitable. Every person should do it because it is profitable. You will come. Every person who lives this way will ultimately come to the end of their lives and not have their life haunt them as they die. But it will haunt them in all of eternity. So long as we are living by those attributes, without Christ, just understand this is as close to heaven as you're going to get. But those attributes, lived with Christ, united to Christ, that he is bringing by the Holy Spirit as we live through them, we will see that this is as close to hell as we will ever experience. So let's not forget the matter. Matter at hand. Remember how Solomon closes out the book. The end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment and every secret thing, whether good or evil. Again, God created us to be upright. Do we, in that moment, do we wish to be seen continuing to scheme against what he created us for? Living with death in mind helps us to make the sacrifices that we need to make, to deny ourselves, to take up our cross, and to follow after him. Resolutely, prudently, wisely, soberly. It helps us to know that despite not having that way before, maybe we haven't been living that way, that in Christ, all the ways that we have lived are forgiven and forgotten. Now, I just want to quickly just give you two practical suggestions about maybe how you can live this way, how you can keep this in mind, because I know, right? I know that as we leave, we may forget what this sermon was about. It's possible. All will be forgotten. It's not an indictment on you, that is an indictment on fallen creation. So let me give you two practical ideas that you might be able to do. One, read obituaries often. That's us going to the house morning. So we can't just always go to a funeral home. But we can pick up, and maybe it's just as often as we see that a celebrity dies and we read through their obituary, what was their life really like? How did they live it? Is that the way I want to live my life? Is that what I want to be remembered for when I die? Read them. Second one, maybe a little bit easier to do. Keep Edwards' quote, his resolution nearby. Maybe get a sticky note, put it on your bathroom mirror, refrigerator, something. Resolved that I will live so as I shall wish I had done when I come to die. And just remember, we live with death in mind. Brothers and sisters, let us live that way. Death in mind, both ours and Christ.